Okay guys, in this particular lesson we're going to focus on cellular transport, so movement across the cell membrane. So like I said, the cell membrane, one of its key roles is really going to be that control, right? That's that whole like it being the bouncer thing that I was talking about. This is controlling movement in and out of the cell, which is that cellular transport. And there are two different processes that we describe when we talk about cellular transport. We talk about physical versus physiological processes. The physical processes, oftentimes what we've actually referred to them as is passive transport, while the physiological we've referred to them as being active. And I think the big thing to remember there is that the passive transport did not require energy, while the active transport required energy. These are two things that we discussed in pretty substantial depth when we were in biology class. But just to jog your memory, the idea that diffusion, osmosis, perhaps two things new, facilitated diffusion and filtration, are types of passive transport not requiring energy, while protein pumps, endocytosis, exocytosis, and another new one, transcytosis, these are going to be active transport mechanisms that are going to require energy. So the first thing we're going to talk about is diffusion, and we should know that diffusion is basically going to be movement, all right, from high concentration to low concentration. And we should know that the movement is going to be high to low in diffusion, and that the reason for that is because it occurs down a concentration gradient. So it's kind of going to flow in a downward manner. I often refer to the gradient or the grade as being like the incline, and it's going to be flowing down the concentration incline from the high down to the low. And like I said, that concentration gradient is just the differences in concentrations. And diffusion is really due to constant motion of particles. And I want you to think about perfume here. I know that last year I sprayed perfume in my classroom when we talked about diffusion and the idea that it moved from one little corner of the room into all areas of the room, and that's because of that constant motion of particles. And we should know that there are certain things that can increase that motion, like temperature. Increase in temperature will increase the motion of the particles and therefore increase the rate of diffusion. And diffusion is going to occur until it reaches equilibrium, diffusional equilibrium, meaning a uniform concentration throughout, which means basically we're going to be even, all right? Even concentration no matter what. So this is just a nice picture showing us diffusion, the idea that if we take a sugar cube and we drop it into water, as it sits there, those sugar molecules are going to diffuse. They're going to slowly start to spread throughout the water, as you can start to see here and here. And it's not going to be until we reach that diffusional equilibrium that a net movement is no longer occurring. And what I mean by net movement is that despite the fact that this is equal and uniform throughout, the molecules are still in motion, and they're going to continue to be in motion indefinitely, so long as it is a liquid. But that equilibrium, one molecule that moves in this direction is going to be counteracted by a molecule moving in that direction, and so on and so forth. So again, showing us that diffusion, that, like I said, at equilibrium, the particles will continue to move, but there's not going to be any net direction, no like overall direction of one way or another. And it's also important to note that this diffusional equilibrium, this evenness, isn't typical for living systems. Instead, what they typically have is something that is referred to as a physiological steady state. And what I'm really referring to there is there's really more of a normal range. There's not going to be one specific set value for equilibrium, but instead it's kind of going to be a range where equilibrium is maintained, because the molecules are always moving and things are always changing within living systems. And we should all know that the only way that diffusion is going to occur is if the membrane is permeable to that substance. We know semi-permeable, it's only going to be permeable to specific substances, and that movement is still, like I said, dependent on that concentration gradient. So another type of passive transport is going to be facilitated diffusion, and we can really think of facilitated as being helped diffusion. Right, this is going to be a case where diffusion can't just occur simply across the cell membrane, so there needs to be some sort of helping molecule involved. And in that case, it's talking about there being channels or carrier molecules, and these channels or carrier molecules, we're talking about those proteins, the proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. And this is going to be kind of important for molecules that are obviously insoluble in the lipid, so they're, water-soluble molecules or something, or they're too large, like glucose, amino acids are good examples. And they are going to utilize these things called channels and carrier molecules. And channels should be relatively familiar to us because we talked about ion channels and such last year in biology class, and the idea that sometimes there are these little pathways that are needed. And then carrier molecules is something that's a little new to us. So with channels, we're really talking about there being open flow, of the molecules, I guess. And we can really kind of think of these as being tunnels through the cell membrane, or like a back door, I think I referred to it as last year. Right? There's another way into the cell for those molecules that can't just go straight through the cell membrane. Likewise, they can move out. Carrier molecule, in this case, the molecule actually fits the carrier to be transported. So as you can see, in this case over here, we're looking at an open channel where molecules are just able to flow through, versus here we're looking at a carrier molecule where a molecule has to move in, it needs to fit into a specific, mold or a specific location, and then that specific location, that fit, triggers it to be able to be moved across the cell membrane. Something that we just want to keep in mind is that the number of channels and carrier proteins limits movement. That should make sense, since the idea of diffusion can just occur whenever it needs to at all times. But if there's an actual molecule that needs to be helping in this situation, well, it's going to depend on how many of them there are to determine the rate of transport or the rate of flow. Really specifically are those carrier proteins. Channels have a bit more open flow to them, like I said, so more molecules are going to be able to move at a time, while as the carrier proteins have a limited number of molecules that they can move at once. This is just a picture that's showing us that idea of facilitated diffusion, specifically being those carrier molecules and a molecule that needs to come in, fit in place, and then it's going to be able to be transported to the other side. We're still moving, though, from high to low, like it says, high to low.